Siegfried Sassoon, decorated for bravery in the killing fields of World War I. A groundbreaking poetic voice who detailed the horrors of the trenches like no one else, and satirised the attitudes and jingoism that fanned the flames of war. A protester who was declared insane and committed to a mental hospital. But what happened during his stay? Was he silenced? Was he cured? Was there ever anything wrong with him?
Hi, I'm Professor Graham Yorston, and today I'm at my local war memorial, and I'm going to be talking about Siegfried Sassoon, First World War poet who was treated for shell shock.
Siegfried Sassoon was born in 1886 in a pretty village in Kent. His father was a member of an immensely wealthy Jewish merchant family, but he was promptly disinherited for marrying outside the faith. His mother was a painter and sculptor from a well-known family of artists. She named her second-born son Siegfried after Wagner's fearless and pure-hearted operatic hero from the Ring Cycle. He was privately educated and went to Cambridge to read law, but left in 1907 without graduating. He spent the next few years hunting, playing cricket and socialising, and dabbling in writing. He wasn't very interested in politics, but as the threat of war in Europe mounted in the summer of 1914, he decided to join the army. He didn't see any early action as he broke his arm in a riding accident before leaving England, and he was then selected for officer training. On the 1st of November 1915, his younger brother was killed in the Gallipoli campaign. In the same month, Siegfried was sent to France, where he was soon confronted by the harsh realities of life on the Western Front. At first, he worked as a transport officer, supplying communication trenches. Not a safe job by any means, as these lines were targeted by enemy artillery. But Sassoon was desperate to be at the front line, and in March 1916, he got what he wanted. The tone of his writing darkened from its pre-war coziness to portray the ugly truths of the trenches to an audience more used to patriotic propaganda. Rotting corpses, mangled limbs, filth, vermin, cowardice and suicide all appear in his work at this time. And this new brutal realism had a significant impact on the development of poetry in the 20th century. Virginia Woolf praised his ability to describe the most sordid and horrible experiences in the world in a manner that no other poet had achieved. He was no shirker, though. He often went out on night raids and bombing patrols and was an effective company commander. His bravery was so inspiring that his men said that they felt confident only when they went out with him. On one occasion, he single-handedly captured a German trench, going over the top and crossing no man's land in broad daylight with minimal covering fire. On reaching the abandoned German trench, he promptly sat down and read a book of poems. His men nicknamed him Mad Jack, and in May 1916 he was awarded the Military Cross for conspicuous gallantry in bringing back the wounded and dead under heavy fire. A few months later, he was injured in the catastrophic Somme offensive, which saw over 1 million men killed or wounded. He was sent to Somerville College in Oxford, which had been set up as a hospital for convalescing officers, describing it as paradise. On his return to France in spring 1917, Sassoon's bravery became more reckless, and he was wounded again during the Battle of Arras after sticking his head above the parapet. Was this a deliberate act to make himself an easy target for German snipers? The night before, he had written in his diary, fully expecting to get killed on Monday morning. His friend and fellow writer Robert Graves certainly thought so, describing him as being in a poor mental state at this time and believing that his bravery had become suicidal. In June 1917, while convalescing from his wounds, and with the encouragement of pacifist friends, including the philosopher Bertrand Russell, he sent a letter to his commanding officer entitled "Finished with the War, a Soldier's Declaration." I am making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority because I believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it. I am a soldier, convinced that I am acting on behalf of soldiers. I believe that the war upon which I entered as a war of defence and liberation has now become a war of aggression and conquest. I have seen and endured the sufferings of the troops, and I can no longer be a party to prolong these sufferings for ends which I believe to be evil and unjust. The letter was published in the Times and read out in Parliament. Some saw it as treasonous, and there were calls for him to be court-martialed for cowardice. But as was often the case, and contrary to what you might think, the army dealt with him sympathetically. During the war, there were about 240,000 British courts-martial. 551 of these were for cowardice, which ended with a guilty verdict and sentence of death. But only 18 were actually carried out. Instead of being shot at dawn, Sassoon was sent to Craiglockhart War Hospital on the outskirts of Edinburgh, a disused hydrotherapy hotel which was converted into a treatment centre for officers diagnosed with shell shock. Sassoon recounts his time at the hospital in his memoirs, and Pat Barker's acclaimed Regeneration novel, made into a sensitive film in 1997, also describes his treatment there. The doctor in charge was W.H.R. Rivers, a distinguished medical scientist and anthropologist before the war, who had been appointed as a psychiatrist in the Royal Army Medical Corps. Rivers believed war neuroses stemmed from the repression of memories of traumatic experiences and unbearable emotions. If a patient could be helped to understand the source of his troubles, he could be freed from ingrained patterns of thinking and behaviour. His Talk and Cure treatment started with educating patients about the basics of psychology and physiology to help them understand why they were experiencing their symptoms. He would then spend 2 or 3 sessions a week talking to them, helping them gradually move towards self-knowledge through a process he called autognosis. Sassoon describes his sessions with Rivers. 3 evenings a week I went along to Rivers' room to give my anti-war complex an airing. We talked a lot about European politicians and what they were saying. Although he was not the first to advocate humane treatment methods for shell shock, Rivers was one of the few who actually carried it out at a time when other doctors took a harsher, more punitive approach. Many senior army commanders regarded Rivers' methods with suspicion, seeing them as too soft and a threat to discipline. One of the other doctors at Craiglockhart, Arthur Brock, took a completely different approach: ergotherapy, or cure by functioning, helping patients rediscover their links with the world from which they had become detached through active and useful functioning, or work. At Craiglockhart, Sassoon met Brock's patient, Wilfred Owen, and his mentoring of the younger man led to an outpouring of work by both of them, some of which are now regarded as among the greatest war poems of all time. Many were published in the hospital's own magazine, which was encouraged as therapy. Although Rivers was acutely aware of the dilemma of treating patients so that they could be sent back to the trenches, it was his duty to do so, and he was able to persuade Sassoon to agree to return to active service. Sassoon wrote later, "Shutting the door of his room for the last time, I left behind me someone who had helped and understood me more than anyone I had ever known. Much as he disliked speeding me back to the trenches, he realised that it was my only way out, and the longer I live, the more right I know him to have been." Some have criticised Rivers for manipulating Sassoon, but Sassoon himself didn't see it that way, and they remained close friends after the war. A medical board passed Sassoon fit, and in November 1917, after 4 months at Craiglockhart, he was posted to Limerick in Ireland, and then to Egypt and Palestine, before he was eventually returned to the Western Front. In July 1918, he was wounded again, shot in the head by a fellow British soldier who mistook him for the enemy. He spent the remainder of the war in Britain at Lennell Auxiliary Hospital in the Scottish borders. His friend Wilfred Owen was not so lucky, killed in France a week before the armistice. After the war, Sassoon spent a brief period as literary editor of a newspaper before going to the United States on a speaking tour, travelling the length and breadth of the country. He was instrumental in bringing Wilfred Owen's work to the attention of a wider audience, and he wrote a series of semi-autobiographical novels about his wartime experiences and treatment at Craiglockhart. He had a number of relationships with men, including Ivan Novello and Prince Philip of Hesse, grandson of the German Emperor. But in 1933 he surprised many of his friends by getting married. He and his wife had a son, but the marriage eventually broke down. He continued to write prose and poetry and maintained his love of cricket until his death at the age of 80 in 1967. Sassoon's story is perhaps the most well documented and discussed case of World War I shell shock treatment, but it was not typical. Most cases of shell shock affected the lower ranks, and their treatment was generally carried out in less salubrious surroundings and with far less humanity. Did Sassoon even have shell shock? His writings suggest he believes he did not. And it is clear that he did not have many of the common presentations of shell shock seen at this time: stammering, shaking, paralysis, mutism. But he did have nightmares and waking hallucinations of the men in his company as if he was still there. And there seems little doubt that with his reckless bravery he came close to getting himself killed. In my career as a psychiatrist, I have seen many military veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder who exhibit the same kind of devil-may-care attitude, driving ridiculously fast, drinking heavily, and getting into pointless fights. Sassoon's protest also suggests to me another common feature of military PTSD: moral injury. A relatively recent term used to describe intense guilt and shame and a profound sense of betrayal and anger towards colleagues, commanders, politics, and society at large. Of course, it would be wrong to think that 21st century PTSD is synonymous with First World War shell shock. How psychiatric syndromes are conceptualized and defined constantly changes, but some of the psychological symptoms that Sassoon appears to have experienced do appear in modern definitions of PTSD. Whether he had the full syndrome is less clear. It can be hard enough to make a diagnosis at a face-to-face assessment lasting several hours. But my sense is that if Lieutenant Sassoon walked into my consulting room now, he would leave with a diagnosis of PTSD. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe and keep the comments and suggestions for new topics coming in. See you next time.